Hello everyone. So I went to a very special event a few days ago. It was for Cyntoia Brown Long's upcoming new book, and I have it right here actually. It's called Free Cyntoia: My Search for Redemption in the American Prison System. And spoiler alert, she found redemption through God, and it helped her really grow her relationship with God. I felt very weird sitting in the auditorium and kind of hearing the way that this narrative has been crafted around her. Carrie Baker, who is the author of Fighting the U.S. Youth Sex Trade, Gender, Race, and Politics, she talks about this change when it comes to this narrative. Politically and ideologically diverse activists joined together to change perceptions and public policies on youth involvement in the sex trade over time. Reframing juvenile prostitution of the 1970s as commercial sexual exploitation of children in the 1990s, and then as domestic minor sex trafficking in the 2000s. The author argues that the very frames that are made in these movements were so successful in achieving new laws and programs for youth, but have limited their ability to achieve systematic reforms that could decrease youth vulnerability in the involvement of the sex trade. And I definitely got that impression when I was there at the event itself, because a lot of the people there actually promoted the Nordic model, although some of these activists seem to be calling it the equality model now. It's the same thing. So what they believe in is in criminalization. They believe in partial criminalization of the sex industry. Now, the place that she's from is Tennessee. During the time she was staying in an in-suite, so like a motel, hotel kind of living situation, and after 3 weeks, she got into the criminal justice system, sadly. And it wasn't the first time she ran into this issue. Before this event that led her to be in the prison system for the next 15 years to be incarcerated, she had already had run-ins with criminal juvenile system. This is kind of why I had some issues with the prevailing narrative around the whole event, which was this idea that prostitution was slavery, or that it was sex trafficking, and that it led to all these things. And also just that most of the people there seem to endorse a kind of end-demand criminalization model. So there's a problem with that. Because she's from Tennessee, by law, the entire sex industry is already illegal. Now, according to them, if they can put in place the end-demand model, it will abolish the entire underground sex industry because there won't be a demand for it anymore. So putting people in prison and leading to violence by the police is supposed to end demand for it, but it's already criminalized. Like, the whole entire industry is already criminalized there, so there's no reason why that would work. The only difference that they put in place is that they wouldn't criminalize women in the sex industry. And I said the word women on purpose. So what the Nordic model basically would do is that it would make it legal for a person to sell sex, but it makes it illegal to buy or basically do anything else. So they would just want to make it legal for a woman to sell sex in the sex industry, but make every other single part of the industry illegal, which obviously would criminalize sex workers still, because you would be criminalized for making money from it, giving other people money from it. Working with other sex workers would still be illegal, because those aren't considered just the act of selling sexual services in and of themselves, which would be the only thing that would be legal. So we would still be criminalized. So most states, I think every state actually, doesn't charge minors with prostitution for very obvious reasons we've established already. So Cyntoia Brown obviously was not charged with prostitution at all. And that's not really the topic that we're talking about, right? With Cyntoia Brown's case, we're actually talking about the criminal justice system. It's not really so much about prostitution, although that's kind of the way they're making it. That's just the narrative they're going with. The sad thing about this narrative, though, is that it doesn't really call for any systematic changes, and it doesn't look at how the system operates, really. In Tennessee, patronizing prostitution, which is basically buying, is illegal. It's already a Class B misdemeanor. Obviously, penalties vary depending on where prostitution or solicitation occurred and whether or not the prostitute knowingly had HIV, and obviously the ages, right? The ages of the buyer or the sex worker matters in this case. This gets kind of weird because there are underage buyers that I think never really gets talked about, but we're not going to get into it in this video. But obviously those things would have to matter when it comes to things like this. So promoting prostitution is when a person does any of the following. If they own, manage, or supervise a prostitution business, right? So that could be her ex-boyfriend, if he manages that and supervises it. Finding a person to work at a brothel or a house of prostitution, which could be anywhere. Encouraging a person to become a prostitute. Soliciting a person to patronize a prostitute, so encouraging somebody to buy a sex worker's time. Finding a prostitute for a person, solicitation, or receiving any benefit from any of the above activities. So if you are somebody that is giving some of your money to your boyfriend or your children or your family, that is considered receiving benefits from prostitution. So it's illegal, all of it. It's considered promoting prostitution. Promoting prostitution is a Class E felony. So you're a felon. So promoting prostitution, which I kind of just read all the definitions of what that is already a felony. It's a Class E felony in Tennessee. It's already highly illegal, which again, people who support the equality, Nordic model, and demand model, which is all the same, it's partial criminalization. This stuff is already illegal there. So they're acting like, oh, this stuff isn't in place and that's why this happened to her, but it already was in place. Cyntoia Brown was not charged with prostitution. That's not the reason why she was in prison. That's not the reason why she has all these charges, right? Which, by the way, her charges were not cleared. She's still convicted of those things, and she's still kind of in prison. Not in prison physically, but she's on supervised parole for the next 10 years. So, you know, she's still a convicted murderer. So nothing has really changed about her situation except that she got clemency, which just is a reduced amount of time. That's all it is. I'm saying this because the other side would make you believe that if their policies had been in place that the situation would change, but their policies have no bearing on this case and similar cases like this. It just ignores reality. Unless they're going to try to completely change the criminal justice system to the point where they are going to redefine anyone who works in the sex industry as an actual slave that cannot be held accountable for anything they do or say, this stuff is going to keep happening, because it's not like you're in the sex industry and then you never do anything else. Like, you only do this one part of the job and you never do anything else, and you never interact with people or give them money, which is criminalized in and of itself, and you never actually do anything, right? So you as a sex worker would never assault somebody, never steal from somebody, never knowingly give someone HIV, never murder somebody, never whatever. You know, we would never break the law outside of this one thing. So the logic doesn't really apply. And that's because they're not looking at the system as a whole and how it works or her specific situation. They're just seeing this person is in the sex industry. They're a sex slave. Therefore, she's in the system because she's in the sex industry, and I can't believe she's even in there. But like, of course she is, you know? Like, imagine if you, I don't know, you had your money stolen from, or you got assaulted by somebody who happened to be in the sex industry, right? Like, what is the police going to do? Are they going to be like, oh, I'm sorry, but they're classified as slaves now, so we can't do anything about that? That's not actually going to change. What needs to change systematically is we need to start decarcerating the entire system, and we need to start coming up with alternatives to it. However, that is not what the opposing side is really looking into. They actually like the criminal justice system, but only want it to work in such a way where if you're a sex worker, the sex work part itself is not criminalized, but everyone else around you is criminalized. And that is supposed to make it so that you will disappear from existence. That's their kind of logic. But that doesn't work, because in Tennessee, all parts of the sex industry are already criminalized, and it's still there. So that doesn't actually work. Cyntoia Brown had previously to these charges has had encounters with the juvenile court system, as I said before. So what we need to look at is the system and how it treats certain people and why. And we also need to kind of, you know, start to abolish it, just saying, or at least reduce it. She was arrested and charged with homicide, aggravated robbery, handgun possession, and criminal impersonation. Those are her charges. The fact that the person that she killed in self-defense was 40, I think he was 43. But again, this stuff is already illegal. Like, having sex with a minor is illegal, although she claims that no sex had occurred and that the violent interaction occurred before any of that could ever take place. But this is already heavily illegal stuff, and that's not going to change. When the situation escalated, she shot him behind the head, and then she took the remaining of his money, I guess, from his pockets. So it was like 174. I don't really remember. It doesn't matter. So she took 2 of his guns, and then she drove away in his truck, and she left it at I think it was a Walmart, and she flagged down another car to drive her to where she was staying at, which was like one of these like motels, hotels type of places, so that she could be with her boyfriend. And that's where the cops found her. Now, obviously, you can understand that the police were not there because she was a sex worker, because she was involved in the sex industry. That's not why they were there, you know? Like, I'm pretty sure somebody reported a murder, so that's probably why they were there. But like, again, when I was at the event, they kind of skirted around that issue. They skirted around the criminal justice system and how it works and why she had all these charges, and they acted like it was just prostitution, and that's the only thing. Why? And if we could just change the laws, that like this would have never happened. But like it would have happened completely the exact same way. Even if she hadn't been in the sex industry, it would have happened. She was sentenced when she was 16, and one of the judges basically said that because she was so dangerous, they couldn't put her in with all the other juveniles, so they had to try her as an adult and put her in with the adults. That was what ended up happening. That didn't really get discussed at all at the event, but it seems kind of important. There was an organization that ended up talking to her and indoctrinating her during her time in prison. It's called End Slavery, and you can see where I'm going to go with this. So she didn't really start to identify with the label sex trafficking or sex slave until she was in her late 20s. I thought it would be a good idea to show you the actual organization that worked with Cyntoia Brown all those years. And keep in mind, it did take her 11 years to start to identify with the label of sex slave or sex trafficking victim. So it's End Slavery, Tennessee. As you can see, all the victims seem to be very pretty little white girls. Now, keep in mind that most people in the sex trade are adults. Most of what anti-trafficking organizations do tends to revolve around the sex industry, and what they tend to do is raise awareness, which is a whole lot of nothing. I don't say that to be mean or anything, but they're largely uneducated of how real people live, and they don't tackle the issue of poverty or economic, income inequality. They don't really talk about that as much. They tend to target very specific people who are trying to survive in the world. I will say I find a lot of this stuff very interesting. You may think slavery ended after the Civil War. Think again. What's really interesting is that the slavery, before the Civil War was systematic. It was the literal kidnapping of people from their countries, taken into boats where many of them died and lived in horrible conditions, and then were sold off with their families on an auction block, unlike this kind of slavery, right? The other thing I find interesting is that slavery didn't exactly end, it was kind of reshaped. The 13th Amendment didn't abolish all forms of slavery. Slavery was still allowed as long as it's punishment for a crime, so you can see what I think about people who believe in criminalization or partial criminalization in order to abolish the sex industry, because they kind of do support this still. They just support that imprisonment should be a punishment for a crime and anything that the state wants to do with you, and that includes if they want to lease you out to a company while you're in prison. And a lot of these nonprofits are actually businesses, and they do put people to work who are in the prison system. So they buy people who are leased out by the prison system. And again, you don't lease out people. You lease out people that you think are property. That's how leasing works. There are more slaves now than at any time in history. This is a very classic line, very frequently used by Kevin Bales, who was the creator of a lot of these narratives. He's also the creator of this narrative. Kevin Bales is a white academic that studies underground populations, quote unquote. You see, the same people who traffic drugs and weapons realize that selling people is more profitable and less risky. Yeah, as an undocumented immigrant, I call bullshit on this. That is not true. I would also love to know who the same people who traffic in drugs and weapons are, because I'm pretty sure they're referring to me or undocumented immigrants. Like, I'm pretty sure that's kind of what they're alluding to here. It's also not true that it's more profitable and less risky. Most people who are smuggled here are willing to pay 10 to 30K in order to be smuggled over, and the idea that people are being kidnapped and then sold overseas for free is ludicrous. Rare if it ever does happen. Why would someone take you across a border for free when they could be getting paid 10 to 30,000 by people who are desperate to be reunited with families? I wanted to go into their tax returns because I thought that would be much more fascinating for you all to see. As you can see, one of the things they do is training sessions. 137 training sessions to 7,072 people, including 198 first-time offenders for soliciting prostitutes. Now remember, this is a misdemeanor. It's already illegal. So there were 198 first-time offenders. I want you to understand that what they're doing here is called John schools. So in other words, they're working with police, and they need police in order to keep their business going. So what they basically do is sometimes they get federal grants or grants with police and whatever financial programs with them. So they put up these John schools or training programs. They're calling it training sessions here, where when they are convicted of buying sexual services or asking somebody for their rates, they get handcuffed and they basically have to decide whether they want to go to jail or go through this program, or sometimes they just don't really get a choice. It all really depends. You'll probably remember that at an earlier point in the video, I talked about young people who were charged with solicitation, with buying, right? There are young people that are buyers. This is what I was talking about. Now, according to the end demand people, these people are evil. They're slave masters, yes, even the young people. And they're evil. And if we just destroy them, if we just let the state enact violence against them, then the industry won't exist anymore. And like everyone will be free. All the slaves will be free from these evil young, buyers that are enslaving them. Also, these evil college students and professionals and faith community leaders, right? They're all evil people. They all just need to be destroyed. They do these training sessions or John schools in groups. So they usually ask them if it's their first time offense or whatever, stuff like that. And then they collect their data. So if we scroll down, we can go to this part of it. So $43,807. They did 22 youth prevention sessions to 926 youth. I want you to understand this as the DARE program. When you went to DARE and you were taught that if you ever do weed or any kind of drug that you're going to die, and that you're a bad person if you do it. And this is kind of what this is, but what they're basically training you in these places is that you are a slave master if you do this or if you are involved, and that you are directly causing slavery, which is really funny from a system that was, built off slavery. It's kind of an interesting lesson coming from them. And yes, I am putting nonprofits into this. They are part of the system. They kind of act like they aren't. They act like they're different or they're trying to reform the system, but they profit from it. They create programs from it. They don't see anything wrong with the criminal justice system because they rely on it. They rely on it. They think it's going to end slavery. So as you can see, they are referred to by local law enforcement. So again, they do need law enforcement in order to do their jobs. People don't just come to them automatically. 104 survivors accepted services and entered the program of end slavery. Remember that these people view everyone who is in the sex trade as a sex slave, so just keep that in mind when they start using this language. 46 survivors. 46 survivors were housed in a safe house. A safe house was purchased, making it the first non-residential property owned by end slavery. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigations trained all local law enforcement. So I want you to understand that when you encounter police in Tennessee, they were all trained by these people. So it's not like they're separate from the system. They work with the system and they literally train the system on how to target certain people. One of the things that they did, besides advocated for Cyntoia Brown, which led to her being granted clemency hearings in 2008, was they testified at congressional hearings on the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act and Stop Online Sex Trafficking bill. So they're the ones responsible, partially responsible for FOSTA SISTA, and you already know where that kind of ends us up in. That was horrible legislation. But they helped pass it and are very proud of it to this day. So it took her about 11 years for her to realize that she was trafficked, and that was kind of what she used to try to get clemency. However, this is not going to apply to most people. Most people aren't going to be able to claim clemency for this. Most people are still going to wind up in prison for various issues, and this is not really going to have a good impact on their lives. It's also the fact that most people like Cyntoia Brown do not identify with the word sex trafficking or sex slave. And what about all the other underground industries? What about the drug trade? What about, migrants? Are we going to have these organizations talking to these kids or teens and saying, hey, you were a slave the entire time, you're trafficked? We're not going to do that. We only do that for the sex industry, which I find really weird, because you could make these arguments for the immigration trade and for the drug trade the exact same way. And in fact, most of our youth are in prison or in juvie because of the drug trade. And a lot of other teens and kids are in the immigration detention centers. So this logic would really help for those. But with prostitution, there's a lot less people, and it's like, you know what I mean? This narrative doesn't really help, and a lot of them do not identify with it. It took her like 11 years to even realize this and start to take that label on for herself. And in the end, she's still a convicted murderer, even though everyone is going on with this, she was a sex slave, she was sex trafficked narrative. The courts still don't see it that way. And I feel like it matters more what the system is doing to migrants and sex workers and people in the drug trade and all these trades, what the system is doing to them, than to kind of make these narratives that kind of obscures from that. The reality is this is not a feel-good story. She's still in the system. This is also like a toxic narrative that I see when it comes to sex workers. Like in the movie Hustlers, where they don't want to be full-service sex workers because they view that as like less than. So instead, what the public ends up cheering for is this idea that sex workers drug and rob men and put their lives in danger and don't give a care if like they accidentally drug somebody and they die. Like that doesn't seem to matter. So that gets celebrated, and it's just kind of bizarre to me. I think it's wrong, but also dangerous. And I also think it's actually very stigmatizing, because they don't actually respect sex workers. They're just kind of delighting in the fact that a movie is essentially saying that they're right about what they think about sex workers, that we're just these kind of horrible people that are, I don't know. And I think what really disturbs me is the people who really love this idea that we're all slaves, because I'm like, do they think that when they see things like this of women drugging and assaulting and stealing the money of men, do they kind of see that as like a slave rebellion or something? Because the way they talk about it, it kind of like goes to that absurd length, and it's bizarre. And in real life, that's not what would happen. In real life, it's actually dangerous to give people advice like this or to even encourage this. If you are somebody who is in the sex trade, you know that ripping somebody off could lead to them killing you, assaulting you, trying to find you and get their stuff back. And this is something that a lot of sex workers deal with, because a lot of people have these perceptions of them already and will make situations dangerous on the assumption that this is something that sex workers are going to do. It's a very dangerous idea that keeps getting pushed out there. And with these narratives about sex slavery and sex trafficking, it makes them worse. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. Let me know if you would like me to read the book and review it for you all and what you thought about this video. I just kind of wanted to make it really quickly and just to go over like some of my general thoughts. I was very disheartened with the fact that this is going to be the narrative that people are going to be pushing. But I'm also just afraid that this might hurt people if it's used to pass another criminalization bill, because it's not actually going to help people like her. It would have had zero impact on her case, and it's going to have zero impact on most people's cases. It won't stop people from being criminalized, because it doesn't actually look at the criminal justice system. Thank you so much for listening.